Hello everyone, today is number 4 in the Blue Clip record. First, let's think about existence and cognition. Does cognition apprehend what already exists? Or does what is cognized thereby come to exist? To address this question, we will briefly examine realism and idealism in European philosophy, followed by Kant's attempt to synthesize the two, and then turn to the Buddhist understanding of the relationship between existence and cognition. In European philosophy, realism may be summarized as follows. Existence comes first, and cognition follows it. By contrast, idealism holds that cognition comes first, and existence is determined by cognition. Kant, who sought to integrate realism and idealism, famously assessed these two positions by saying, each is half right and half wrong. Kant's integrative structure is as follows. Kant distinguishes two aspects of cognition. Number one, the form of cognition lies in the subject. Time, space, and categories such as causality and substance. This is the idealist element. Number two, the material of cognition comes from outside. Sensory stimulation, something that affects us. This is the realist element. Accordingly, Kant concludes, the world as we know it is the result of something external plus the structure of human cognition. Thus, like realism, Kant does not deny external stimulation, and like idealism, he maintains that the structure of cognition actively constitutes the world. This position may be summarized as follows. Cognition does not conform to objects. Rather, objects conform to cognition. Yet, cognition does not arise out of nothing. This is also captured in Kant's famous dictum. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Concepts without intuitions are empty. Here, intuition, that is, sensibility, corresponds to the realist element, and concept, that is, forms of cognition correspond to the idealist element. For Kant, therefore, existence is neither a thing in itself, independent of cognition, nor a mere illusion arbitrarily produced by the mind. Rather, existence is that which appears in a way that is cognitively accessible. But Kant's problem is the thing in itself. However, Kant introduces the concept of the thing in itself to explain his position. The thing in itself is assumed to exist prior to human sensibility and categories, yet it can never be known. It functions as a limiting concept that supposedly makes phenomena possible. This gives rise to serious problems. First, Kant claims that the thing in itself cannot be known, yet still asserts that it exists, thereby falling into a self-contradiction. Second, although Kant insists that causality applies only within the realm of phenomena, he nonetheless speaks of the thing in itself as if it were the cause of phenomena, implicitly applying causality where it should not apply. As a result, Kant leaves intact a rigid division between the knowable world, that is, phenomena, and the unknowable world, that is, the thing in itself. He thus fails to overcome dualism and merely preserves it in a refined form. In this sense, Kant does not escape what Whitehead famously called the condition that European philosophy is nothing more than a series of footnotes to Plato. Next, the Buddhist perspective on existence and cognition. How, then, does Buddhism understand the relationship between existence and cognition? In Buddhism, the Buddha declares all is the 12 sense basis. That is, all phenomena arise within a dependently originated structure consisting of the 6 sense faculties: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, and the 6 sense objects: form, sound, smell, taste, touch, mental objects. Crucially, Buddhism denies both. A world consisting solely of objects and a pure, independent, cognitive subject. What exists is always sense faculty plus object plus consciousness. It is a dependently arisen event. Buddhism beyond realism and idealism. Thus, Buddhism is neither realism, which says we cognize what already exists, nor idealism, which says cognition creates existence. Rather, Buddhism holds existence and cognition arise together dependently. In Buddhist terminology, consciousness conditions name and form, and name and form condition consciousness. There is no existence without cognition, and no cognition without existence. Therefore, existence and cognition cannot be separated. Yet, Buddhism adds an important qualification. They are not two, but they are not one either. Why not one? Because cognition is always conditioned, and existence is never a fixed substance. Both are without self-nature. Hence, Buddhism is neither ontology nor epistemology in the Western sense. It articulates a middle way, grounded in dependent origination. As the Muramadhyama Kakarika states, it is neither existence nor non-existence, neither both, nor neither. Final clarification. If one asks, do we cognize what exists? Buddhism replies, no, because the very concept of existence already lies within conditions of cognition. If one asks, does cognition itself exist? Buddhism replies, no as well. Because cognition cannot arise without objects, faculties, and conditions. If one then asks, are existence and cognition inseparable? Buddhism answers, they cannot be separated, but one must be careful. To say they are one leads to substantialism, and to say they are two leads to dualization. Substantialism occurs when a flow, relation, or process is mistaken for a fixed entity. As when one says existence and cognition are one, and imagines a single enduring substance. Dualization occurs when an analytical distinction is mistaken for an actual division in reality. Thus, Buddhism does not affirm either the identity or the duality of existence and cognition. Rather, it affirms their dependent core arising. Next, 화두 number 4. Zen Master Doksan arrived at Master Wisan. Zen monk Doksan. Number 1, this is pointer. Under the blue sky, in the bright sunlight, you don't have to point out this and that anymore. But the causal conditions of time and season still require you to give the medicine in accordance with the disease. But tell me, is it better to let go, or is it better to hold still? Number 2, this is 화두. When Zen monk Doksan arrived at Master Wisan, he carried his bundle with him into the teaching hall, where he crossed from east to west and from west to east. He looked around and said, "There is nothing, no one." Then he went out. Master Soltu added the comment, "Completely exposed." But when Doksan got to the monastery gate, he said, "Still, I shouldn't be so coarse." So he re-entered the hall with full ceremony to meet Master Wisan. As Master Wisan sat there, Doksan held up his sitting mat and said, "Teacher." Master Wisan reached for his whisk, whereupon Doksan shouted, shook out his sleeves, and left. Master Soltu added the comment, "Completely exposed." Doksan turned his back on the teaching hall, put on his straw sandals, and departed. That evening, Master Wisan asked the head monk, Where is the newcomer who just came?" The head monk answered, "At that time he turned his back on the teaching hall, put on his straw sandals, and departed." Master Wisan said, "Hereafter, that lad will go to the summit of a solitary peak, build himself a grass hut, and go on scolding the Buddhas and reviling the patriarchs." Master Soltu added the comment, "He adds frost to snow." What do you think? What kind of 화두 is this? How could such a apparently irrelevant and unexpected story become the fourth 화두, taking its place as an official 화두? Only when a person's wisdom surpasses that of flying creatures can one catch flying creatures. Only when a person's wisdom surpasses that of beasts on land can one catch beasts on land. And only when a person's wisdom surpasses that of other human beings can one subdue human beings. If one truly investigates Visan's Zen in this spirit and gains strength from it, then even if the entire great earth, with all its myriad forms and phenomena, heaven and hell, grasses and trees, humans and animals, were all to shout hard at once, Zen Master Visan would not be the least bit shaken. Even if he were to overturn the meditation cushion and shout, driving the assembly away, he would remain utterly unconcerned. Thus, it may be said that Visan's realm was as high as heaven, and as deep and solid as the earth. If Visan had not possessed the skill to overpower the words of all under heaven, then when he fell into Doksan stratagem, it would have been extremely difficult for him to escape. And if Master Visan had not been a master commanding 1,500 disciples, then when Doksan lifted his sitting mat and called out, "Vulnerable," Visan might well have been completely at loss for words. But Visan, even while he did, was able to discern victory and defeat 1,000 miles away. Doksan then turned his back on the Dharma hall, put on his shoes, and left. Now tell me, what was Doksan's true intention? As for this matter, after long and sustained practice, Soltu was able to penetrate the profound, the difficult points among the Hwadus of the ancients. Only then could he offer such a poignant appraisal. One cannot help but say that this is truly remarkable. Now, let me ask one more question. When Doksan met Zen Master Visan, why did he lift the sitting mat and call out, "Vulnerable"? If you do not understand this principle, you will never pass through the gate of Zen, nor will you be able to stretch out your legs and rest in ease. First, let's examine the verse composed by Zen Master Heian-shin to this Suhat. The tiger's cave. The forest is so deep that people can't come. If anyone comes, they are definitely hunters. The old tiger was surprised and opened his eyes. Suddenly, he jumped out and saved his life. Next, I read the verse to this hut. What kind of weird words and actions are these? Then what the hell is it? The roe deer of the mountain runs away in surprise. Oh, no. The broken branches fell down and splashed on the ground. The roe deer of the mountain runs away in surprise. Today, let's call it a day.